I didn't know what to expect when I moved in with Mark after Mom's passing. He was kind, patient, and tried his best to make me feel at home, but there was always a strange weight in the air. We were strangers forced into a family by circumstance, and now, grief was the only thread tying us together. The house was too quiet when I arrived. My suitcase clattered against the floor as I stepped inside, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. Mark appeared a moment later, his smile warm but hesitant. He looked older than I remembered, his dark hair streaked with silver and his eyes tired. "Emma," he said, pulling me into a brief hug. "It's good to see you." "You too," I murmured, my voice small. "Let me show you to your room," he said, gesturing for me to follow. The guest room was simple but comfortable, with soft gray walls and a window overlooking the garden. "If you need anything, just let me know," he said, lingering in the doorway. "Thanks," I said, offering a faint smile. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Dinner's at 6. As he disappeared down the hall, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the neatly made sheets. This wasn't home. It would never be home. But it was all I had now. The first few weeks passed in a blur of quiet dinners and polite conversations. Mark and I were careful around each other, our interactions tinged with an awkwardness neither of us knew how to navigate. He tried his best to make me feel comfortable, cooking my favorite meals and asking about my classes, but the grief hung heavy between us, an unspoken presence neither of us could escape. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, he finally broke the silence. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle. I hesitated, my fork hovering over my plate. "I'm okay," I said, though the words felt like a lie. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's okay not to be," he said softly. His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. "Thanks," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. As the days turned into weeks, we began to find a rhythm. Mark worked long hours at his office, and I threw myself into my studies, grateful for the distraction. But in the evenings, we often found ourselves in the living room, the silence between us growing less awkward with each passing day. One night, as we watched a documentary on wildlife, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Your mom loved this sort of thing," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "She did," I said, my chest tightening. He sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I miss her every day." "Me too," I said, my voice breaking. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of our shared loss pressing down on us. Then he reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. "We'll get through this," he said softly. His touch was warm, comforting, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Over time, our conversations became more personal, more vulnerable. Mark told me stories about my mom I'd never heard before, about their first date, the way she'd laugh when he teased her, the dreams they'd shared. "She was incredible," he said one evening as we sat on the back porch, the cool night air wrapping around us. "She was," I agreed, my chest tightening. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "You remind me of her," he said softly. The words caught me off guard, and I wasn't sure how to respond. "Thanks," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. His gaze lingered for a moment longer before he looked away, his expression unreadable. It happened late one night. I couldn't sleep, the memories of my mom too vivid to ignore. I wandered into the living room, finding Mark sitting on the couch, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. "No," I said, sitting down beside him. We sat in silence for a while, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Then he spoke, his voice trembling. "Sometimes I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to keep going without her." "You're doing great," I said, my chest tightening. "Better than I am, at least." He smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "You're stronger than you think, Emma." I looked at him then, my eyes searching his. "I don't feel strong," I admitted. His hand brushed against mine, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged, the silence heavy with something unspoken. But then he pulled away, his expression conflicted. "We should get some rest," he said quietly, standing up. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaky. "Good night, Mark." "Good night, Emma," he said, disappearing down the hall. As I sat there alone in the dimly lit room, my heart raced with questions I wasn't ready to answer. After that night, something changed. Our conversations were still warm, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Every glance, every touch, felt heavier, more significant. One afternoon, as we worked together in the garden, he reached out to help me steady a wheelbarrow. His hand brushed against mine, lingering just a second too long. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us moved. "Thanks," I said quickly, pulling my hand away. "Of course," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes searching mine. The moment passed, but the memory of it lingered, a quiet reminder of the line we were dangerously close to crossing. The days turned into weeks, and the quiet moments between Mark and me became more frequent, more charged. It wasn't something we talked about, but it was there, an unspoken tension that hung in the air, growing heavier with each passing day. One evening, as I was finishing my homework at the dining table, Mark walked in carrying 2 cups of tea. "Thought you could use this," he said, setting one down in front of me. "Thanks," I said, offering him a small smile. He sat down across from me, his gaze soft but intense. "You work too hard," he said teasingly. "I have to," I replied, shrugging. "College applications don't write themselves." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Your mom would have been so proud of you." The mention of her name sent a pang through my chest, and I looked away, blinking back tears. "I hope so," I said quietly. "She would," he said firmly, his voice steady. "I know it." His words meant more than I could say, and for a moment, I forgot about everything else. The next day, Aunt Laura came over. She was my mom's sister, and her visits always left me feeling uneasy. She had a way of looking at me, at Mark, that felt too sharp, too knowing. "How are you holding up, Emma?" she asked, her tone dripping with concern. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "And you, Mark?" she asked, her gaze shifting to him. "Must be a lot, managing everything on your own." "I'm doing my best," he said, his tone even. Her eyes flicked between us, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It's good you two have each other," she said. "Family is everything." There was something in her voice, in the way she said it, that made my stomach twist. That night, I found Mark in the living room again, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head, sitting down beside him. "No." For a while, we sat in silence, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the room. Then he spoke, his voice low. "Do you ever feel like you're drowning?" I turned to him, my chest tightening. "What do you mean?" "Like no matter what you do, it's never enough," he said, his gaze distant. "Like you're just stuck." "I feel like that all the time," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else I couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry," he said, his hand brushing against mine. "For what?" I asked, my heart racing. "For not being enough," he said quietly. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. "You are enough," I said softly. His eyes met mine, and the silence between us felt charged, electric. But before either of us could say anything, he pulled back, his expression conflicted. "Good night, Emma," he said, standing abruptly and leaving the room. "Good night," I whispered, my chest tight. The following weekend, Laura visited again, bringing her sharp eyes and probing questions. "You've done a great job with Emma," she told Mark as they sat in the kitchen. "She seems comfortable here." "She's been through a lot," Mark said, his tone cautious. "She's lucky to have you," Laura said, her gaze lingering on him. "Not everyone would step up like you have." Mark shifted uncomfortably, and I watched from the doorway, my heart racing. Laura's words felt pointed, deliberate, as though she were testing him. "Well," Mark said finally, standing, "I should check on the garden." As he left, Laura turned her attention to me, her eyes narrowing. "You've been spending a lot of time with Mark," she said casually. "He's been helping me adjust," I said, forcing a smile. "Of course," she said, her tone light but her gaze sharp. "Just make sure you don't forget who he is." Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I avoided her gaze, my mind racing. That evening, after Laura had left, Mark and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. The tension from earlier still lingered, and I could see the stress etched across his face. "You okay?" I asked, my voice soft. He looked at me, his expression weary. "It's been a long day." I hesitated, then stepped closer, my hand brushing against his. "You don't have to do this alone," I said. He looked down at our hands, his gaze lingering before he met my eyes. "Neither do you," he said softly. For a moment, the world seemed to fade away, the weight of everything else disappearing. And then, before I could think better of it, I leaned in, my lips brushing against his. The kiss was brief, hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me that left me breathless. When I pulled back, his eyes were wide, his expression torn. "Emma," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We can't." "I know," I said quickly, my cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry. He reached out then, his hand brushing against my cheek. "It's okay," he said softly. "It's just complicated." "Yeah," I said, my heart racing. The moment passed, and we stepped away from each other, the silence between us heavy with unspoken emotions. After that night, everything changed. The air between us was charged, every glance and touch filled with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. We tried to act normal, to pretend like nothing had happened, but it was a fragile illusion that could shatter at any moment. And as the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Laura had seen through us, that she was waiting for the right moment to expose what we were so desperately trying to hide. The kiss changed everything. Mark and I avoided talking about it, but the silence between us spoke louder than words ever could. Every shared glance, every accidental touch felt like a secret whispered too loudly. But the world outside our fragile bubble kept moving, and Laura's sharp eyes seemed to linger longer each time she visited. Her questions became more pointed, her tone edged with suspicion. "You've been spending a lot of time here, Emma," she said one afternoon, her voice casual but her gaze piercing. "Do you ever think about going back to campus housing?" "Not really," I replied, trying to sound indifferent. "It's nice here. Peaceful." She hummed thoughtfully, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I suppose Mark's been good company." The way she said his name made my stomach twist. That evening, I found Mark in the garden, pruning the roses. He looked up as I approached, his face softening into a tired smile. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. "Laura's suspicious," I said quietly. His expression darkened. "What did she say?" "Nothing direct," I said. "But she keeps making comments. Watching us." He sighed, setting the shears down. "I knew this was a bad idea," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Mark," I began, but he cut me off. "I should have been more careful," he said, his voice strained. "This is my fault." "It's not," I said firmly. "We both." "I can't lose you," he said suddenly, his voice breaking. The raw emotion in his words stunned me, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. "You won't," I said finally, my voice trembling. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't a promise I could keep. The following week, Laura showed up unannounced, her sharp gaze taking in every detail as she stepped into the house. Mark and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken tension between us heavier than ever. "I thought I'd bring some leftovers," Laura said, setting a casserole dish on the counter. "It's nice to share a meal with family, isn't it?" Her tone was light, but her eyes told a different story. As we sat down to dinner, the conversation was stilted, every word feeling like a test. Laura's questions were pointed, her gaze flicking between Mark and me like a hawk circling its prey. "You've been spending a lot of time in the garden," she said to Mark, her tone casual. Emma must be learning a lot from you. She's a quick learner, Mark replied evenly, though his grip on his fork was tight. And you seem very close, Laura added, her smile sharp. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could feel my cheeks burning. Family should be close, Mark said finally, his voice steady, but his eyes hard. Laura hummed thoughtfully, her gaze lingering on me. Yes, they should. That night, after Laura had left, I found Mark sitting in the living room, his head in his hands. She knows, he said quietly as I entered. She doesn't know anything, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. She suspects, he said, looking up at me. And it's only a matter of time before she says something to someone else. Then what do we do? I asked, my chest tightening. He hesitated, his gaze heavy. Maybe I should send you back to campus, he said finally. What? I asked, my voice sharp. It's the only way to protect you, he said. To keep her from ruining your life. And what about you? I asked, my throat tight. His smile was sad. I'll manage. No, I said firmly, stepping closer. We'll figure this out. Together. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his eyes searching mine. Then he nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Together, he said softly. But together didn't last long. The next time Laura visited, her suspicions boiled over. You're hiding something, she said bluntly as we sat in the kitchen. Mark stiffened, his jaw tightening. What are you talking about? You and Emma, she said, her gaze piercing. There's something off. You're imagining things, Mark said, his voice steady but cold. Am I? Laura asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. Because I don't think I am. And I don't think your neighbors will, either. Her words hung in the air like a threat, and my chest tightened with fear. You need to leave, Mark said suddenly, his voice sharp. Laura's eyes widened, but she quickly recovered, her lips curving into a smug smile. Fine, she said, standing. But this isn't over. As the door slammed shut behind her, Mark let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling. She'll ruin us, he said quietly, his voice filled with despair. Then we don't give her the chance, I said firmly. Laura's departure left the house in a tense, uneasy silence. Mark and I avoided speaking about her accusations, but her words lingered in the air, a shadow over every interaction. She's going to tell someone, Mark said one evening, his voice low. She doesn't have proof, I replied, though my confidence was fading with every passing day. He shook his head, his jaw tight. It doesn't matter. Suspicion alone is enough to ruin everything. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him we'd be okay, but deep down, I knew he was right. The following weekend, I came downstairs to find Mark pacing the living room, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. What's wrong? I asked, my chest tightening. Laura called, he said, his voice strained. She's coming over. I froze, my heart pounding. Why? She said she wants to talk, he replied, running a hand through his hair. But we both know what that means. What do we do? I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated, his gaze heavy. We act normal. We don't give her any reason to think she's right. I nodded, though the knot in my stomach told me it wouldn't be that simple. Laura arrived an hour later, her expression cool and calculated as she stepped inside. I thought we could have a chat, she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Of course, Mark said, forcing a smile. We sat in the living room, the tension thick as Laura's gaze flicked between us. It's nice to see you both getting along so well, she said, her lips curving into a faint smile. We've been managing, Mark replied evenly. More than managing, it seems, she said, her tone pointed. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Mark's been really supportive, I said, keeping my voice steady. I'm sure he has, Laura said, her gaze lingering on me. He's always been good at taking care of things. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could feel Mark tensing beside me. Is there something you want to say, Laura? He asked, his tone sharp. She smiled, leaning back in her chair. Not at all. I just think it's important to be honest with each other. Don't you? The silence that followed was deafening, and I could feel the weight of her gaze pressing down on me. That night, after Laura had left, Mark and I sat in the dimly lit living room, the tension between us unbearable. "She's not going to stop," he said quietly. "She can't prove anything," I said, though the words felt hollow. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice heavy. "People will believe her." I looked at him, my chest tightening. "What do we do?" He hesitated, his gaze filled with conflict. "Maybe you should leave," he said finally, his voice breaking.
"What?"
I asked, my heart sinking. "It's the only way to protect you," he said, his eyes filled with pain. "If you're not here, she can't use you against me." I shook my head, tears filling my eyes. "I'm not leaving you," I said firmly. "Emma," he began, but I cut him off. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "We're in this together." For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with unspoken emotions. Then he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "I don't deserve you," he said softly. "You deserve more than you think," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The following day, Mark received a call from a mutual friend of Laura's, asking about the rumors. I overheard the conversation from the hallway, my stomach twisting with fear. "It's nothing," Mark said firmly. "Laura's just stirring up trouble." But as he hung up, his shoulders sagged, and I could see the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "She's spreading it around," he said, his voice hollow. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond, his gaze distant. That evening, as we sat on the back porch, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Mark turned to me, his expression pained. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he admitted, his voice breaking. "You don't have to do it alone," I said, my chest tightening. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "I wish things were different," he said softly. "Me too," I whispered, tears filling my eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to fade away, the weight of our situation forgotten. But the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment, and we sprang apart, our hearts racing. Laura stepped out of the car, her expression smug as she approached the porch. "I thought we should clear the air," she said, her tone dripping with false sincerity. "There's nothing to clear," Mark said sharply. She smiled, her eyes gleaming. "Isn't there?" The tension between them crackled like a live wire, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath us. "Why are you here, Laura?" Mark asked, his voice low and dangerous. "To make sure you're both okay," she said, her gaze flicking to me. The silence that followed was unbearable, and I could feel the walls closing in around us. Laura's smug expression as she stood on the porch sent a jolt of panic through me. Mark stepped in front of me slightly, his posture tense, as though shielding me from whatever storm she was about to unleash. "What are you really here for, Laura?" Mark asked, his tone sharp. Her smile widened. "Oh, just making sure everything is appropriate." "Enough," Mark snapped, his patience clearly fraying. "If you have something to say, just say it." Laura's eyes flicked to me, her gaze sharp. "It's obvious to anyone paying attention," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "The way you look at each other, the way you act around each other, it's disgusting." "That's enough," Mark said, his voice rising. I felt my cheeks burn, my heart pounding in my chest. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Oh, don't I?" Laura shot back, stepping closer. "You think people haven't noticed? You think I haven't noticed? This little charade you've been playing won't hold up for long." Mark squared his shoulders, his expression hard. "You have no idea what you're accusing us of, and frankly, I don't care what you think you know. You need to leave."
"Now?"
Laura laughed, the sound cold and bitter. "You think you can just dismiss me? That I'll walk away and pretend I didn't see what I've seen?" "I think you need to mind your own business," Mark said, his voice steady but seething with anger. Her gaze flicked to me, her eyes narrowing. "Is this what you want, Emma? To ruin your life for this?" "It's not your life," I said quietly, my voice shaking. "It's mine." For a moment, Laura seemed taken aback, but she quickly recovered, her lips curling into a sneer. "Fine," she said, stepping back. "But don't say I didn't warn you when everything falls apart." She turned on her heel and walked back to her car, slamming the door behind her. The sound of the engine roaring to life echoed through the quiet evening as she drove away, leaving us standing on the porch in stunned silence. "That's it," Mark said finally, his voice tight. "She's going to tell everyone." "She doesn't have proof," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "It doesn't matter," he said, running a hand through his hair. "She'll make sure people believe her." I stepped closer, my chest tightening. "What do we do?" He looked at me, his expression torn. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. "We'll figure it out," I said softly, reaching for his hand. He hesitated for a moment, then squeezed my hand tightly. "Together," he said, though the word felt more like a hope than a promise. Over the next few days, the tension in the house became unbearable. Mark barely spoke, his usual calm replaced by a restless energy that kept him pacing the rooms late into the night. "I can't do this to you," he said one evening as we sat in the living room. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my chest tightening. "This," he said, gesturing between us. "It's not fair to you. I've made your life impossible." "No," I said firmly, my voice trembling. "You've made it better." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with pain. "Emma, you deserve a chance to live your life without this hanging over you." "Without me hanging over you?" Tears filled my eyes as I shook my head. "You're not a burden," I said, my voice breaking. "You're the only thing keeping me going." For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of everything pressing down on us. Then he stood, his shoulders slumping. "I think it's best if I leave for a while," he said quietly.
What?
I asked, my heart sinking. "I'll stay at a hotel," he said, his voice heavy. "Give you some space. Give both of us some space." "No," I said, standing. "You don't have to." "It's the only way," he said firmly. "I can't let Laura destroy you because of me." Mark left the next morning, the house feeling unbearably empty without him. He didn't say when he'd be back, and I didn't ask, afraid of the answer. For weeks, I tried to adjust to life without him, throwing myself into my studies and trying to ignore the ache in my chest. Laura's rumors circulated, but without Mark's presence, they lost their edge, and people seemed to move on. But I couldn't. One evening, as I sat in the living room, the sound of the door opening made my heart leap. I turned to see Mark standing there, his expression hesitant. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice soft. Tears filled my eyes as I stood, crossing the room to him. "You came back," I whispered. "Of course I did," he said, pulling me into a tight embrace. "I always will." Mark's return didn't solve everything, but it gave us hope. We agreed to take things one day at a time, to rebuild what we could, and face whatever came our way together. Life wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Sometimes, love doesn't follow the rules. Sometimes, it doesn't make sense, but it's real. And sometimes, that's all that matters.